Good evening, and welcome to the Chatham Marconi Speaker Series. My name is Liz McCart, and I am a volunteer here at the center. We are so pleased you have joined us for the presentation tonight. Tonight's program will take us beyond our Marconi-built Chatham site and introduce us to Chatham's sister stations across the country, with particular attention to Belmar, New Jersey. As a reminder, you can ask questions by tapping on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, typing in your question during the program, and our speaker will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. It is my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Fred Carl. Fred is on the Board of Trustees of the Info Age Museum in Wall, New Jersey. He founded the museum in 2005. He saved the historic campus, which was a Marconi-built station, which was used over years and served the US military in various capacities until about 1997. Fred was instrumental in having the site listed on the National Register of Historic Places and its prestigious status as a National Historic Landmark. The museum also became a Save America's Treasures site and Preserve America steward. Fred was recognized in 2018 by Preservation New Jersey with the Sarah P. Fisk Legacy Award. Fred received his Bachelor of Science in Science Education and his Master's of Science in Computer Science from Monmouth University. He also has teaching certificates in Comprehensive Sciences and Computer Science. Fred currently works in the physics department at Princeton University. So it's my pleasure now, Fred, to turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Liz. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. We will go into presentation mode. All right. Liz, how does that look from your side?
That looks good. Thank you.
All right. The Marconi stations made a large contribution to history, but there's some factors why they're little known, and we'll touch upon that. But on your screen, you see some photos of the Belmar station, which has a very rich history. But to get there, we needed a foundation. And the foundation is in science. It's observation, a publication, mathematical theory, experimentation, and vision. So we start with Michael Faraday, and he published his electrical elemental experimental research in electricity, which was read by James Clerk Maxwell. And James Maxwell took Faraday's experiments and turned them into mathematical equations. And the ones you see here are the rework by the famous Oliver Heaviside. And he published his work and in 2 volumes. And that work was read by many. One of the most famous is Heinrich Hertz. So you have Faraday working heavily between 1839 and 55, Maxwell creating his electromagnetic theory published in 1865. Notice the time gaps here. And then you have the experimentalist Heinrich Hertz. Here's his apparatus here. To those of you who know Marconi equipment, some of the parts will seem familiar. And then from Hertz's luckily finding these waves that Maxwell had predicted, and they were called Hertzian waves for a while, they went around for a number of years in scientific demos, but nobody thought you could use them for signaling until the man, Guglielmo Marconi, had the vision and the faith and the whole package to turn this into a desktop demo into something that could go where no wire could go, first to a ship and eventually to outer space. He had the business sense, the sales, the promotion, and the legal considerations and the drive to make this invention happen, okay? Now, the first time he demoed it in the United States, not far from Chatham, was at Sandy Hook. He was invited by a newspaper to show off his new equipment in the America's Cup race. He set up his equipment near, or the receiver, by the Marconi Tower, excuse me, by the Twin Lights tower here. And here's the advertisement about it. And the US Navy came to watch the demonstration, and it was very successful, but unfortunately, the Navy didn't have the vision to buy his stuff. And down here, whoops, down here at this same spot, if you recognize the light tower, the fathers of Army radar set up their experimental radars on the same spot as Marconi's 1899. It's one of those cool connections in history. But Marconi was not happy with ship to shore. He wanted to go across the Atlantic, which was expected to be impossible because they thought that electromagnetic waves went straight like a beam and they would not follow the curvature of the Earth. Well, Marconi disproved that. And on December 12th in 1901, his people sent the S signal, or a dot, 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 across the Atlantic from Ireland to Newfoundland. And he elevated his wire by use of a kite. Pretty tricky. Ties him into Ben Franklin. And luckily, neither one got electrocuted. Right? Now, one of the first US stations was on Cape Cod. Possibly you've heard of the place, on Marconi Beach. And Marconi was great at adopting and adapting technology. So to hold his wires as high as possible to capture these Hertzian waves, which we now call radio waves, he took ship mast builder technology and hired people to build masts. Don't they look like masts on a schooner or a clipper ship, right? But two things were against him. One was weather. Here's another view of his station, and shortly after, a ice storm would come and wreck all his rigging, and he would have to start over again and build a much stronger mast, which here's one that fell in the 1920s. Okay. Now, his vision grows to take on the undersea cable industry, where there's big profits, and he could send a message across, and his investment in equipment was a fraction compared to all the challenges of deploying and maintaining an undersea cable from, say, London to New York, right? It was just a problem. Wireless was a little too newfangled. Matter of fact, when he did his first S across the Atlantic, many people thought that it was a lie, that he had done that, right? So he's having trouble selling stock to the level that he needs. So this is what happens. A disaster gets him on the map. And that disaster, as many of you know, is the Titanic disaster. He had put Marconi's best equipment and trained operators on board the Titanic. And here's a advertisement in the Marconi publication called the Marconigram. And you know what happened. They hit an iceberg, they sunk, the wireless message got out. And that is what saved the people who got in the lifeboats. Normally, no one would know what would have happened. Right? And if those of you who've watched the movie like The Unsinkable Molly Brown, you see them saying, keep the lifeboats together, keep them together, because the chance of being found in the open sea was very low. And if no one was looking for you, it was even lower. And as a demonstration of how perilous it was, there was one lifeboat that didn't stay with the others, and they found that lifeboat with skeletons in it a few months later. So he changed the whole world of shipping and made it safer. But like a lot of tragedies, the government got in action and they created the Radio Act in 1912. And that impacted the Marconi stations in two ways. One, well, here's some of the other accidents that Marconi, his equipment helped. Okay? And notice it's a sea full of disasters. So here's a little talk about his wireless girdle that he called it. It was a triumph, but Marconi did so many things and he was so awesome that when it occurred, his own greatness, as well as war and politics and a corporate takeover, makes it so if you read most biographies of Marconi, it hardly mentioned his world encircling globe. Now, once he had the money to start building his vision of stations around the globe, he couldn't afford large tracts of land nearby cities where most of his business would be. So inside of an office in, say, New York or London, there would be a telegraph that a customer would go in, fill out a Marconigram blank, and that would be telegraphed to the distant site. Okay? And they usually, like Chatham's an exception, because Chatham's right in Chatham, but like the Belmar station and the New Brunswick station are both in different towns. But if your town, like Wall Township or Franklin Township, did not have a train station, you were not on the map. So that's usually why you were named, or your station was named for another city. And most of them were sleepy backwaters. They used the J.G. White Engineering Corporation to engineer the sites and manage the construction. And here are the sites. You see your favorite Chatham there. And, you know, that covers from the East Coast all the way to Hawaii, quite a breadth. And you've heard of the Brooklyn Bridge and Roebling's Wire. Well, that's what they use to hold up the mass, the Roebling wire. Okay, and you'll see a picture of some of that close up. Okay, now Marconi had a magazine, one in England called Wireless World, and another one in the United States called Wireless Age. And with each publication, as these stations were being built, they updated their subscribers with the progress on the station, because this was really cutting edge. And so here you see my favorite station up here, the Belmar station, okay? One of the fireplaces in California, one of the New Brunswick station being built, its operations center, one of the masts being erected, more updates and further additions. These are the California stations, and down here is the New Brunswick station. Okay. Another view of the Cocoa Head or the Hawaii stations. And notice their balancing tower, just like those in Chatham. Okay. And look at the massive equipment you needed to get the job done. More shots. This one is of Belmar. This house later got moved, and is now a residence. Over here, this is one of the guy wires, and we actually found that when buried. And here's the false work for the Marconi Hotel. Here are the circuits. Each pair of stations, there was a sender and a receiver. For example, at Belmar in circuit number 2, the Carnarvon station in Wales would send messages to Belmar, and a landline, the message would be tapped out at the beginning on a telegraph in Belmar that would go to New Brunswick, and it would be transmitted back to Great Britain, and vice versa. It was like a big circle, right? So circuit number 3, Chatham received from Norway. They had a wire going to Marion, and messages that were tapped out in Chatham would go on to Norway, right? And here are the other 2 stations. And notice that the Hawaii stations send to Japan. Okay. Now, the theory in the beginning was that in order to get the messages across, they couldn't explain, they didn't really fully understand the ionosphere at this point. They did notice that it was unreliable, that the message would bounce off the ionosphere and get across, in this case, to Wall Township, New Jersey. But there was a technical problems. Because of sunspots, the ionosphere would be disrupted. At night, when our transmission between Great Britain and United States was behind the Earth and away from the sun, the Earth would shield the ionosphere from disruptions from sunspots. So it would be like skipping stones off a lake. You'd get a reliable transmission. But as soon as the Earth turned and the ionosphere was exposed to the sun, you would lose good transmission if there was high sunspot activity. So it was unreliable and difficult, right? So here's the Wales connection, right? You see Carnarvon is up there, and over here at Cardiff University is one of my colleagues. So, and now there were 2 flavors of hotels. Why did they have a hotel? Because you needed a staff of 90 to run a 24-hour wireless station. Here's the station in Marshall, California. Notice it looks very similar, almost identical. They only did local foundation changes. And one thing unique about the Marshall, California station is in front of this is the San Andreas Fault. Okay. Now there was one station in Hawaii that sometime in the mid-1920s disappeared off the map of history. It turned out that the Royal Hawaiian family had purchased it because all those nice 45 rooms made great rest home rooms. And so to this day, the Cocoa Head Station, which Cocoa Head was an extinct volcano near Diamond Head, is now a rest home. And one interesting thing is all these stations had libraries in the center 3 windows, right? And they had a lending library, and we were lucky enough to get these books back, and they are now back in its library, and there's been no overdue book charge. Here's the Marconi Hotel at Belmar being built. Here's the New Brunswick station being built. In this case, Here's the hotel, very much like yours. Right? The two residents and the operation building. Notice one of the masts we can see in the picture. And in the background here, what looks like maybe a road or a sidewalk is actually the Morris Canal. And here's the Raritan River. Notice all the tiles here. When this building was going to be demolished, we got the permission of the new owner and we stripped off most of the tiles off of this building and off of this building prior to their demolition. And we have those stored to make repairs at Belmar. And it was interesting for the molding, you'd flip over certain pieces of molding and in chalk, it would be written New Brunswick. And we suspect that some of the molding at Camp Evans or the Belmar station has chalked Belmar behind them. Now this is how they constructed the masts. And there was a crew of specialists who did this. Here's the erection crew at Belmar, who most likely came to Chatham and put up those antenna or masts also. And they were put together with like half steel barrels with flanges, and they would put them 90 degrees or 45 degrees from each one. And they used like a lifting crow's nest to do it. Could you imagine doing that? Putting up a number of plates and then lifting this up by a pulley, putting some more plates and lifting it up. Not the kind of job I'd want. Okay, here's another example of them pulling plates up. And here's almost virtually the same spot during World War II. The Marconi antenna field, these were dropped by like 1926 because of the value of their metal. But when World War II came along, the Army purchased the Marconi property from the college that owned it then, and they used it for further radar development. And underneath where the wires for the Marconi antennas, they built a training facility. Notice these World War II radars, 3 versions of them, and teams of civilians would be trained on how to build these, how to set them up, how to test them, because the Army, even though they needed them, they didn't have the staff. They needed to get bullets and food and things in to be ready for battle. And just like wireless was once too newfangled, so was radar. Thanks to my friends at CMMC, I have a collection of great photographs that were in the scrapbook of C.H. Taylor. He was one of the leaders in their transoceanic division. And here is that Roebling wire, possibly being sealed with molten lead so the strands don't unfurl. Okay, pretty nice catch for a document hunter. Okay. A power station just like yours in Chatham, and a balancing 4 balancing towers at Belmar, and only a part of one has survived. All the others fell because of deterioration down near the ground. Now, Marconi had a manufacturing facility near a town called Aldine, and unfortunately, the building just within the last 3 months got demolished, but it served the country in World War I very well. Over $1 million of wireless equipment was built in these factories, and the factory during World War I was guarded by Marines to protect it from German saboteurs. Now, even before the Belmar operating station was finished, it played a role in history. Edwin Armstrong, the genius of circuits, he contacted a fellow named David Sarnoff, who was a manager in the Marconi company, and said, I have this new patent. I think you'll be interested. It boosts wireless signal. Said, well, I want to see it demoed. I'll meet you. And he took the train to Belmar, took a car ride over to this building under construction. And in this shack, they were so thrilled the results, they worked all night. And that's one of those celebrated events in wireless history. When Sarnoff did his memoirs, that's in the beginning. And he and Armstrong, if they could, they would telegraph each other every year until they started fighting each other in court over FM rights. But Armstrong was a genius, and this is where he did one of his first great demonstrations. Okay. Now, the stations were just about finished and the world changed. If you give this a quick scan, it'll say the war has hit Europe, and the Marconi stations that would send and receive to Belmar and New Brunswick have been seized by the government because of their strategic value, and these stations are isolated. Okay. But during that time, a lot of research went on, and this gentleman, Roy Wengan, made another major innovation at a Marconi station, and this was static elimination. If you recall that sunspots can wreck a transmission, and there are station logs at the Smithsonian from the Belmar station, and they list whole 8-hour periods during the day where if there were bad sunspots, you couldn't hear because of the bangs, hisses, and crashes that they described at the time. And his circuitry canceled that out to where you could hear it. Those of you who've heard some radio history, you'll hear people in 1906 talking about how they could do voice and broadcast over radio out to ships at sea or to other people with equipment, because it wasn't that ubiquitous as it is now. Yep, if you had the perfect day, you could, but you couldn't count on it 24 hours a day, 365 days. So this was a major breakthrough. Here's a little synopsis. This was fun to find this account at the Smithsonian and later at the Princeton University Firestone Library. And it basically says Marconi is invited to come and see a demo of this static elimination. And he says to the author of this book that was never published, I've seen this perhaps 100 attempts like this. And in so many words, this is going to be discouraging. And the only reason I came is to please Mr. Wengan. Well, the result is Marconi says to him, it is worth $1 million because now they can have clear reception even with static in the background. But it turns out nobody gets the $1 million. They alert the Navy because it's now war, and the Navy declares this top secret, and they use it as a strategic communication advantage during World War I. And when it was announced at the end of the war, I want to say 1919, it was hailed in the press as the most important advance of the decade. Now, there was a lot of pioneers at the Belmar station and possibly Chatham during the war, and the Navy officer who was in charge of the station was Ahoy Taylor, and people of note who came there, and most of the stations was Ernst Alexander, Harold Beveridge, and of course, Roy Wengan. And the Marconi factory was busy cranking out over $1 million. Okay? And some of the first they did is the first to contact France and Italy and Germany. They detected strange wireless sounds. They were somehow able to get it into an early recording device and slow it down. And they determined that the Germans were recording wireless messages and then putting them into some sort of wired recording device and then playing them at high speed over the wireless. They did early radio propaganda, and Mr. Beveridge, the Germans were trying to do disruption signals to American wireless, and he came up with the antenna they called the barrage antenna that dampened their ability to mess up American communications. And a cool thing to me is here's A. Hoyt Taylor. He had lost the bid to make, after the war, a research laboratory in New Jersey, even with the help of Thomas Edison. But in 1921, he was told by the Navy to create a research facility near Washington for radio research dedicated to the Navy. And most of his staff, like over 60%, were his staff from the Belmar station. And that team went to create naval radar during World War II. So you have the fathers of Navy and Army radar connected with the Marconi station. And it's one of the things where people predicted things. In 1921 at the Waldorf Astoria, Marconi in a speech predicted there could be a way of spotting ships and planes with radio, and it would take 10 to 15 years when all the needed components were available. But that's one of the things that led to the development of radar. Okay. Now, these sites were so important that the Navy had Marines protecting the station 24 hours a day, armed guard. And underneath the transmission station, because the transmitters were so powerful and gave up so much energy that the marching soldiers had to wear mittens so they wouldn't shocks, because their bayonets would act like lightning rods. So it was interesting times. There were a few times people of German heritage were arrested for snooping too close to the stations, and a lot of research was done. If you were at the German station in Tuckerton, you had a bad day at work because the Marines marched in, arrested you as a German enemy, and you were put in a prisoner of war camp for the duration of the war. Now, the Navy directed Mr. Taylor to go and create a network to get messages from the United States to the troops in Europe and back, because again, you couldn't depend on local sunspot conditions. So on a day where you could receive at Chatham perfectly, you couldn't receive at Belmar or at Maine. So they set this elaborate network of the stations wired together, and Chatham and Belmar were wired directly during much of World War I. Okay. And here's some of the details. It's sort of like an eye test, but the Marconi stations in New Brunswick and Belmar and Chatham and a facility in Bar Harbor were all taken over by the Navy. And this was the cutting edge of communication. And the Germans had a smaller network, a station in Nauen, Germany, which is just outside of Berlin. And they weren't on talking terms until later in the war. So that is courtesy of the authority of the Radio Act of 1912. Okay. And where your call letters at Chatham were MCC for Marconi Cape Cod, okay, which I think would later become WCC. Camp Evans, or the Belmar station, was WII. And that sort of gets lost because during World War I, it was given new call letters, and that was NFF. And that was well known during World War I. Here's the Tuckerton station. They only had one mast, which was 500 feet tall, and they would talk between Germany and United States. And again, it was a bad day on April 6th when the United States got into war because you were arrested and made a prisoner of war. Okay. Alrighty. Now, during the Navy days, you had staff on the station. We didn't know much, and it was a very interesting time when I was at Sanford University and doing some research, and I found that Camp Evans was involved in World War I as well as Chatham, and it was run by the Navy. So that was a lot of fun, but then I had to hunt down more information. And that information came from this book, Radio Reminiscences. And here are a dozen stories about what happened at Camp Evans or Belmar during the war and their work with some of the other Marconi stations. At one point during the war, they were running low on coal because of a railroad strike. They outlawed that shortly afterwards, but they went to the local school system and commandeered all their coal. So Asbury's school system got a winter vacation unexpectedly. And another amazing thing is with new generating equipment or a new alternator made by Ernst Alexanderson, which was an incredible breakthrough, they could now send voice messages on the wireless more reliably. So President Wilson was able to do this, to send the conditions for the armistice. I think it was the 11 points. And that was like the beginning of radio propaganda, because you're sending radio messages into an enemy's country. Now, not too many people had the wireless equipment to receive it because it was the early days, but those who did, this helped foment some of the unhappiness and sparked a small revolution in Germany that led to the armistice. Now, the work by Weygand doomed the Marconi station. You didn't need the towers anymore, right? So by 1926, they took down the 400-foot antennas. The property, they tried to use it for a short time for ship to shore, but to expand the station to serve more stations in Europe and transmit more reliably in the United States, they needed a larger antenna field and the Waltown bargain price. So it was more economical to close the station, take the equipment they wanted and the furniture, and rebuild a new station in Riverhead, Long Island. And that became known as Radio Central. And they took the books from the library with them. And years later, I met the station manager through friends, and he donated to us the books that he had inherited from the library here. Not all Marconi stations ended in happiness or get preserved, you know, thanks to you and Chatham, right? And you have a wonderful mission and are doing great things. Here's the Belmar station, right? Where they amazed Einstein and others with the wonders of wireless, right? It was demolished to make way for a used self-store. How sad, you know, right? Now, after the war, the Navy decided that they wanted to control wireless. So not to be told what to do by Congress, who said, no, Navy's going to be a commercial adventure. The Navy inspired Westinghouse and AT&T and others to put funds together and to buy out American Marconi in a stock takeover. And that new company was renamed Radio Corporation of America and RCA. And so your property and our properties and the others became original RCA properties. And here are some great shots of the operation station on file at the Smithsonian. Here's Professor Einstein, Proteus Steinmetz, and other luminaries of the early 1920s radio days at the New Brunswick station on the cover of Wireless Age. Now, this person here in one publication was identified as Nicholas Tesla. And that seems strange to me because he was well known and he's not listed here. So I contacted his nephew who looked at the photograph and said, yeah, it may look like my uncle, but he would not be in the background. So I don't think it's him. And then I contacted the AT&T laboratories and said, can you send me, or their historian, can you send me a picture of this fellow, John Carson? And they did. And he turned out to be a dead ringer for Tesla. It was pretty entertaining. So here's what somebody wrote in a non-disclosed author, and this is his final chapter about being in a Marconi station. Belmar, it is a sweet and ominous name. A pile of money went up the flue there. Technical reputations were lost and gained. There are heartbreaks, private and corporate, and now there's silence. So they had corporate parties, they had romance, they had technical challenges, but as the person ended the story, the bright star of Belmar, like our youth, must also pass away. So it looked like that was the end of Belmar. It went through a few hands, non-radio related activities, and then it was purchased by the US Army and it became important in communications, but now it wasn't just wireless, it was radar, and they eclipsed all the amazing World War I and early Marconi history. And that's why in the case of Camp Evans, it was elevated to this level of National Historic Landmark. So there's tons more history. A historian at Fort Monmouth, when I was writing the National Register nomination, one day he sort of lectured me and said, stop. You're never gonna stop finding Camp Evans history. You keep adding stuff to your narrative. You're almost at 40 pages. You've made the case, submitted, so you get on the register and move on. So I took his advice, I did, and the site's now on the National Register, and he was so right. There are days at the museum where people walk in with stacks of photographs and documents, and it's really fun. And so I want to say thank you, and I'd be happy for any questions.
Thank you, Fred. That was great. I can't believe the research that you have and the photographs, and certainly a perspective of World War I that maybe some of us are not aware of. So that was great. So we'll just give our viewers an opportunity to write in some questions. So while we're waiting for our viewers, you want to talk a little bit about what the Info Age Museum is now?
Well, it is this campus. This is what we were able to save. And you see right here, here's the Marconi Hotel. Here's the manager's cottage, engineer's cottage, the power station, very similar to yours, if not identical. And down the hill is the operations building outside here. Here is the old antenna field. And this is where the radar laboratory was expanded. And here, this was it. And during World War II, with about 30 more buildings over in this area, because we couldn't save it all. We only saved 16 buildings out of the 50 that were there, because, you know, to be a private nonprofit, 37 acres and 16 major buildings is a challenge, but we're hanging in there because we have this awesome history. Here's the radar pioneers on this, one of the steps of the Marconi Hotel. And
That's a great picture. We certainly recognize the hotel in the background.
yep, there's the same kind of railings and the terracotta tiles. And
Yes.
you know, we're a group of volunteers just like you. And here's our, down the bottom is our first load of kids. We have a mission to inspire people to learn science. And there's a challenge. You can't fix anything these days. You can't become a family hero changing vacuum tubes. Maybe you can help your parents install apps, but you know, it's tougher these days. So we've created a funzium. We have a hall of fame. We have archives and a library. And we jokingly say we just do electrons and waves. And there's lots of fun benefits. Okay. You know, more history when it was a college. Its time in World War II lasted. Here's some of the other buildings that were not in the illustration. And as we learn more, in this photograph, you see some radars up under my cursor. We found photos of those in Iwo Jima, right? Some of these radars, you know, models on ships were put right into battle before the islands were secured. And some of the other radars were, models of radar were landed on D-Day. It's just awesome, okay? The amount of impact that this Marconi station had on history. Fixed radars, mobile radars. Okay. Protecting the Panama Canal by putting Army radar on ships and doing picket duty off the shore of each end of the canal. Okay. Of course, there were artists on staff who did motivational kind of paintings and also did illustrations and manuals, because even the manuals had to be written in secret. Okay, they didn't have a you know, instant printing place with enemy spies in it. Okay, and they would take captured enemy equipment. This you recognize these German uniforms. This is a German gun directing radar, where they actually captured one and it was flown, or the parts of it were flown back to Camp Evans, repaired and got back into usage so we could come up with countermeasures. Here's a mobile radar that they landed on D-Day. And look at that vacuum tube that was the cover tube of electronics. Okay. Microwave radar that came out towards the end of the war, but it was awesome. And here's some of the things where it was used. In Anzio, on D-Day, it helped shoot down the buzz bombs. And it was so important that we help our allies. We even shared it with the Soviets, which in the Cold War, we came to regret, okay? They did all sorts of preparation for the invasion on D-Day, okay? They helped with the spoofing by radar. One of the reasons the Germans didn't counterattack quickly is because their radar screens off of Calais, where it would make more sense for the landings to occur, had a larger fleet approaching it on their radar screens than there was approaching D-Day. And it was all radar electronic warfare trickery. Pretty amazing, huh? And that's one of the things that, you know, is lost in all the bravery that happened on the beaches because it's played a small role, but important role. Some of the devices designed and tested at Camp Evans were used in Bastogne to get supplies into the surrounded troops. Here's a picture of the Bastogne guys with one of the beacons on top of building supplies, homing in the supply drop C-47s, okay? And it was all done with vacuum tubes and no integrated circuits, no transistors. They weren't invented yet, okay? And there were lots of women, more women, I think, than men. And we have a quote here from Eleanor Roosevelt. Do you like that one, Liz?
It's great. Yeah.
And here we go. Okay. Rosie the Riveter. Okay. Well, she had sisters at Camp Evans. And, in this picture, you can see 3 women. And I don't have them here, but there were lots of women in the metal shop. And here's a group photo. You see lots of women. And also, they hired persons of color in technical occupation. So that was really cutting edge. And one of our volunteers did a thing of a little granddaughter sitting on the lap of her grandma, and the grandma was a Rosie, and she was passing on the spirit. And
that's fabulous. That's, it's amazing, even though unfortunately Belmar was closed as an RCA site, but it went on to really have quite a legacy in our military history.
Yeah.
So that's incredible.
Yep. And
yeah,
here's just a newspaper story, one of many all over the nation. The day World War II ended and radar was called a major reason of victory. And here's radar at Camp Evans. And here's the naval inventors of radar, Ahoy Taylor, who you heard about earlier. So it was pretty amazing. All done by citizens of New Jersey in shops and laboratories. And once they did the engineering drawings and the contracts were made, they were manufactured in facilities all over New Jersey and in Boston, because they worked hand in hand with the scientists at MIT and Harvard. They brought German Operation Paperclip scientists over after the war. They bounced the first signal off the moon, which was cool, because as you recall, a Marconi station depended on bouncing radio waves off the ionosphere to go across the ocean. Well, this Marconi station pierced the ionosphere and proved you could do communications in space. Pretty neat. Okay. McCarthy came there, bad day at the office, okay, and 30 people got suspended, who were all later reinstated, but it was an ugly chapter in American history. And, Marconi was so outrageous that McCarthy was so outrageous that they named an era of history after him.
Yep.
It's space research. Here's early satellite models in a Quonset hut that was put up in Marconi's old antenna field. And you notice here, they thought they were going to track the first American launch. Well, guess who came out first? And people got award certificates for helping characterize Sputnik for so many volunteer hours. And you were called the Royal Order of Sputnik Chasers with your diploma. See the problem here? It's endless.
Yes.
The Weather Channel, the first broadcast of cloud cover from a satellite was beamed to Camp Evans from this Tyro satellite. And the first photo was flown by jet and handed to President Eisenhower. So they did nuclear research. We kid around that there were Egyptian ruins in Camp Evans. Well, actually, this is behind this bromide window. And they actually had a nuclear testing facility at old Camp Evans. Here's a 25-foot deep pool where they kept a 5,000 curie source of cobalt-60 for nuclear hardness testing. So
it's well worth a trip to New Jersey to visit your museum. It sounds quite amazing. So we do have a couple of questions I do want to get to from some of our viewers. Tom would like to know what you can tell us about the Hawaii station. He's heard that there may be an effort to save the buildings.
Yes, that is true. The Cocoa Head Station is, again, a nursing home, but the other station does have a group who's trying to save it, which is wonderful. Let's go over and find the name of the site. Kahuka. All right. And that's the one that transmits to Japan. Last time I saw photographs of it, it was in dire need, but so was Camp Evans. You know what I mean? Your station was in great shape. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thanks. We have another comment from David. He says, an excellent presentation, and that he met you several years ago, but he thoroughly enjoyed this presentation. So thank you for that comment. Peter has a quick question. What was the main reason for receiving stations and their corresponding transmitting stations to be separated?
Because they wanted to be able to send and receive at the same time. Previous to that, if the equipment was too close, it interfered with one another. So you would have to transmit, turn over the control to the other side once they verified that they got the message, and then they would send back. So if you separated the stations by 20 or 40 miles and had balancing towers to suppress interference from the other transmitter, you could transmit up to like 100 words a minute. And words meant money. Here's one of the balancing towers again. Okay, the people paid by the word, so the more words you could transmit, the more money went into the Marconi Corporation.
Okay, thank you for that. And you mentioned RCA and the Alexanderson. So I would just like to invite everyone to come to our museum and see the centennial panels that we talk about in depth about the RCA history. This year we're celebrating the third of 3 centennials with the transition to ship to shore communication. So we do talk about that history since it's so significant to RCA and the founding of the station. So I think we're just about running out of time here. So I want to thank you very much, Fred, for this wonderful presentation. I think we all learned a lot. As a small gesture of appreciation, and hopefully you don't have one already, because I know you've been to our site, but we will be sending you Chatham Marconi Maritime ball cap.
Cool.
So you can wear that proudly at Belmar.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, you might be able to give it to my grandchildren who are in nearby Chatham this week. So.
Oh, good. Well, we certainly would love to see them come to the museum then.
They will.
Yeah, good. Good. And I want to also thank all of our viewers and members and supporters for coming tonight, as well as coming to the museum. We do have another program on August 12th with Mark Faraday, who he's the science coordinator at the Mass Audubon Society, and he'll be talking to us about the resurgence of osprey. So if you've been to the museum, you've seen we have a very active nest on top of one of our radio towers, and he'll talk to us about these wonderful birds. So thank you again and have a good night.